Russian forces are launching a new large-scale offensive in the eastern part of the country, calling it Phase 2 of its special military operation. Well, this morning in the besieged port city of Mariupol, reports of intense shelling at a steel factory. Video showing plumes of smoke rising from the plant. Ukraine says dozens of families have been sheltering at that factory now for weeks, and those inside say conditions are deteriorating. Food and water now is limited. CNN correspondent Matt Rivers is reporting from Lviv in western Ukraine, and CNN senior correspondent Ed Lavandera is in the capital city of Kyiv. Matt, first to you. President Zelensky says Russian forces have now started the battle for Donbas in eastern Ukraine. What are we seeing unfold in the country this morning?
Yeah, safe to say that we have now officially seen the beginning of what we have been waiting for days, if not weeks now, which is this ramped up, intensified Russian offensive designed to capture the Donbas region in the eastern part of the country. We heard yesterday afternoon from first regional military officials in places like Donetsk and Luhansk saying that they believed that this offensive had begun, and it was late last night in his evening address that President Zelensky also said the same thing. Stepped up tanks, artillery, lots more ground troops. You're talking about tens of thousands of Russian troops that have been repositioned into the eastern part of the country, and they now trying to move south and east to capture the Donbas region. We know that certain towns in the area, Ukrainian towns, have fallen, like Kremenna, for example, to Russian forces, with Ukrainian officials saying that they have what they have calling a tactical retreat in that area. But we also know that front lines across the region, the Ukrainians are putting up a fight. What they are seeing, according to Ukrainian officials, is a change in tactics on the part of the Russians because of what they learned from what they didn't do correctly in the northern part of the Ukraine during their failed attempt to capture Kyiv.
The enemy is changing tactic, and that is confirmed. That is the reason for that is that it has suffered losses in terms of heavy artillery, in terms of its weapons, and also personnel. They're forced to be more economical in terms of how they use their force, and they have to focus on certain areas.
What we know, though, is that this is not going to be a quick campaign here. We're talking about battles that will go on for weeks and could be bloodier than anything we've seen so far.
The true battle for the country is yet to unfold. Matt, thank you. Well, Ed, I want to get to you there in Kyiv because Ukrainian officials say that Russian forces are shelling the Azovstal steel factory in that besieged port city of Mariupol. We've seen images of mothers there with their children desperate to get out. What more are we learning?
Well, it seems like with every hour that passes by and the news that emerges from Mariupol, you just have to wonder how much more can the civilians and fighters, Ukrainian fighters inside that city withstand, given that they've held on to that city for more than a month and a half, Bianna. But the news continues to get more grim. We believe that there could be as many as about 1,000 people inside that steel factory, barricading themselves from the incessant shelling that continues there toward them. And this is a city that has been besieged for weeks. What is making matters even more complicated today is that there are no agreed upon humanitarian corridors that might give civilians an opportunity to escape from that city. We are told by Ukrainian officials that no humanitarian corridors do exist, that even the paths that could be used are being shelled and attacked as well. So far too dangerous for civilians to be able to escape from that area as well. The Russian military also said several hours ago that they had offered an opportunity for those forces inside the factory to surrender. The deadline for that came and went several hours ago. No indication that the forces inside the factory have accepted the surrender. There was a similar offer made on Sunday that was ignored by the Ukrainian forces inside Mariupol, so I can't imagine that would change today. They have been saying for weeks that they would fight until the very end. Bianna?
And keep in mind, Ed, that the President Zelensky himself said that they don't have an accurate account for how many civilians remain in that city, how many have been killed thus far. This is all still yet to be investigated and determined, but we know that number is unfortunately going to be very high. Ed Lavandera, thank you. Well, Ukraine's railways are critical lifelines running across the country, supplying troops and evacuating civilians. I'm joined now by the head of Ukrainian Railways, Alexander Kamyshin. Alexander, thank you so much for joining us. You know, I just recently, in the last hour, spoke with the mayor of Mykolaiv, who is warning his citizens to leave the country. We're hearing that from mayors across the country there now. So many in that country rely on those railways. How safe are they today?
Javiana, nice to hear you. Thanks for inviting. Indeed, it's not safe across the whole Ukraine. Yesterday we got shelling of Lviv, and we keep running even though they shell our stations across the whole country. 2 days before, on Sunday, I've been to Kramatorsk, Pokrovsk, and other cities on deep east. And what I would say that the evacuation program is currently going down on that area. We got a fraction of what we've got at the peak days. For instance, yesterday we done 195 people from Pokrovsk, comparing to 10,000 we got in the peak from that area. And indeed, those people whom we evacuate now are hard to move. People, elderly, and people from hospitals, those people who are less mobile. That's why it's really important for us to be available for evacuation until the last moment. Indeed, all people around expect ignition from another wave. That's why we are doing our best to evacuate those people who are still willing to evacuate.
Do you get a sense that Russians are targeting these railways to attack the Ukrainian troops who also utilize them, or civilians? Obviously, we cannot get those images out of those civilians that were killed in Chernihiv 2 weeks ago. 50 civilians there, including children.
Biana, they target schools, kindergartens, theaters, and civilian buildings. That's why you can't say they target railway stations in some specific way. Definitely when they shell tracks, we understand that they target them. But we learned how to repair them and go on running the evacuation program.
Part of what makes Ukrainians and your bravery throughout this terrible war so inspiring is that what you just said, you keep rebuilding, you keep fighting. How are you managing to rebuild these train stations, including that in Chernihiv, in the midst of what's now going to be an even greater, larger scale phase 2 part of the war?
Yana, it's a really nice case, Chernihiv, because once military troops made Russians leave the city, we took 1 week to restore the infrastructure and sent the first train to Chernihiv. I can say that first 3 days of this train shows that we got 100% of occupancy. And indeed, it was really important to restore railway connectivity to the city, because that's passenger traffic, that's humanitarian aid, and that's cargo. We should keep running economy as well. That's why it was really important to bring Chernihiv back to railways.
Yeah, a really important moment of symbolism there to say that you are still operating, right, and these trains are still running. My last question to you is what are you telling citizens there now who understandably are afraid to flee in the midst of danger because they're afraid that they will be killed and attacked as they step on board a train?
Bayana, meanwhile, railway stations and railway trains remain the safest place in this country, because people know that they shell again civilian buildings, theaters, schools, and so on. That's why they do not shell stations more than other buildings. And we introduce all the security measures to make this transportation safe.
Well, you're absolutely right. They bombed a building in Mariupol where it was explicitly clear that there were children. It was written there, Дети, children, and Russians bombed them nonetheless. Alexander Kamyshin, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. Stay safe.
Thanks, Bayana.